This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored in part by Allison Cook and Super Inframan. Help us out by becoming a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I have helping me with this show, Mr. Tyler Bell.
Greetings.
And we have as our guest, Anthony Tyler.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Returning to the show. You've only been on once before, right?
Correct.
Okay, I couldn't remember. Because you had your dive manual, I remember that.
Yeah, the last time I was on the show, I was, I've been doing some journalism and stuff before I took a break, so I'd been around a little bit, but I was so new, I didn't even have a website yet, so it's been a minute now. Got some things going. Divemind.net, but we'll talk more about that stuff later. Yeah, but thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed our talk last time, and this time you have the Hunt manual that you've published. And last time I had Ren on with you because I thought Ren would enjoy the conversation, and this time I felt the same way about Taylor, so I brought him into this.
Excellent. I love the company.
And so tell us a little bit about this Hunt manual.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last book, Dive Manual, long story short, the context of it is, I would say it's a lot of, esoterica, like comparative religion, mysticism, that Jungian mindset. And it's got like a strong undercurrent of like Forteana and unexplainable. And the dive motif being focused around definitely the divine feminine, but the book not exclusively like centered around that. But Hunt Manual, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite, where it's got a nice backbone of the esoterica, but it's a real strong running look at Forteana and unexplainable phenomena, and also how that is different from considerations of like good and evil and demonology, how it intersects. And it has, in terms of like that Jungian backbone, it's very much focused on like the shadow complex, and existential horror and fear itself. So, I go into everything from to my Fortean stuff like cryptozoology, the paranormal. There's some UFO talk in there. And I finally get an opportunity to talk about true crime. So there's some serial killer and cult leader stuff in there. And definitely just like me taking an opportunity to work with all the horror that I've grown up with. I grew up on horror movies and Stephen King and Richard Matheson and, metal and punk rock. So it's all kind of in there. I wanted to create and it's kind of set, it's got like I don't even know what you'd call it, like a meta narrative or something, where I'm kind of talking to the reader throughout both of them. And we're kind of going on like an adventure together, and I'm explaining things to you. The first one being Dive, this one being like kind of like an Evil Dead cabin in the woods start out motif. And yeah, I had a lot of fun working with that. So yeah, I'm glad it's out now.
Yeah, so it's basically a one-way conversation.
Right. Like a little bit of like a Socratic dialogue type thing, a one-way conversation. Yeah.
Just because it's like a monologue almost, instead of dialogue. But
yeah.
Fascinating format.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've written other things in the past. Like cutting my teeth on I have like a couple fictional books that I just wrote in high school that I never even released. Just figuring out stuff. And I grew up in Alaska, and so when you get tired of like partying and being cold, doing winter things, you do other things. And I wrote a lot. So but yeah, so after a while, I'm sure I'll go back to it eventually, but I just kind of got tired of like standard narrative play. And I've always liked like Tarantino and Chris Nolan. Like I've always been fascinated by just unorthodox ways of storytelling. So this is kind of my stab at that, I guess.
Definitely. So is the dive manual in a similar vein with the sort of dialogue or monologue kind of couched in fiction, or
Totally.
is that I haven't
Absolutely.
read dive manual? Okay.
Yeah, and they feed off of each other a little bit. Certainly the subject matter, like they can be read separately and there's no loss. But if you read them together, there is a little bit of synergy there for sure. So
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah. But yeah. So I mean, I don't know where you guys want to start out. There's plenty of things we could unpack. I'm looking forward to it.
One of the things I find that holds true over and over again is Jung had a lot of insight into this stuff that seems to hold true as time goes on.
No kidding.
Absolutely. I think his mindset and his like he was really good at being skeptical and having the backbone of empiricism, but not like remaining exclusively in that realm. And I don't know, it's for whatever reason, it's so hard to find people willing to do that. And that's why I like people, again, like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, Manly P. Hall. These are names that are, not only do they have this mindset, but they've got so much material out there, and it's really refreshing, this sort of Fortean mindset. 'Cause, I mean, that's really honestly what Jung had, a very Fortean mindset. I'm sure him and Charles Fort would have gotten along real well.
Oh yeah.
And and it, Jung's latter work is especially interesting because he didn't have much, if anything, left to prove to himself or anybody else, and he just kind of, just like especially with memories, dreams, reflections, and things, all his personal insights into his life are really fascinating. And yeah, he was no stranger to the unexplainable. There's some accounts, I believe it was Colin Wilson, who talks about some of some poltergeist type events that were happening with Jung's family during his childhood. Like one of his cousins, he experienced some interesting stuff. And he also, like you look at the Black Book and Red Books, and he had a really vivid fantasy life in terms of like the dreamscape and the constructive like adaptation mechanisms of mysticism. Like you could pretty much call Jung a wizard, honestly.
Yeah.
Like a real wizard.
And he had his own personal daemon that he interacted with.
Not to
Right,
mention
right.
he built an entire wizard tower basically all by himself on I don't know if it was on a peninsula or an island, but
Really?
yeah, he
I
constructed
didn't
an
know that.
entire like tower and added onto it and sort of made it a home over time. As far as I understand, entirely by himself using materials he took from the world, just like
Wow.
crafted
what?
the whole thing. Yeah,
Dang.
it's a really interesting, But, speaking of Jung, I think archetypes is something that really comes back again and again with Hunt Manual. Is something I noticed a lot in there, is this idea of sort of like an archetypal, almost like an archetypal journey, I guess, of especially with the hunt premises, right? And like hunting down those demons and, getting into the shadow and working through these sort of elements of self and elements of other, and understanding them as being, substantial in an archetypal way. That's something that was really interesting to me. I guess I don't have a particular question about that, but that's something that really popped out to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you see archetypes? Or
I appreciate that. Part of my interest in like the dive and hunt motifs is there's plenty of like reason to just, it's fun and like a creative writing exercise type thing. But like part of the practicality that I'm trying to impress is like the idea that, it's found all throughout comparative religion, but I find one of the most poignant allegories to be the Masonic one, where it's just, like brick by brick building the temple, building your existence, and your mind, body, and spirit, the temple with which you pay homage to the cosmos, essentially. And, when you look at things like archetypes and even memetics, you see that are these building blocks to the psyche and to our perceptions and, to our approach with existence itself. And, if you don't learn the tools of that trade, if you don't learn to like build yourself, then you're going to be built anyway. That's just like the inertia of life itself. And that's why there's this split, and I don't fully understand why. Because obviously I'm all for the scientific method, but scientism as this ideology, the thing that essentially Charles Fort was like constantly stabbing at, it just completely discounts the subjective because it's, I don't know, almost considered like some sort of byproduct of the objective and nothing more really. And sometimes that's the case. Determinism is part of it, but that's only part of it. If you discount the subjective, you're just simply, discounting half the data. It's the context that's key. That doesn't mean that you throw out a whole portion of the, because especially when we're looking at unexplainable phenomena, like mystical experience included, then the only common denominator we have is the human experience. So I don't know, and I guess that's why the materialists just want to throw it out, because they're just not ready, willing, or able to work with these things as the building blocks they are. And some people, I think, they definitely do it a little bit of a disservice by new aging it up a little bit. And just kind of like, because the importance of it are the fact that we can find psychological control methods to symbolism and the imagination itself. So if you're taking those control methods out, which is what like New Age tends to do sometimes, not always, but sometimes, especially with certain people, like it defeats the whole purpose.
Yeah.
So what in particular do you mean by the like control methods?
Yeah, good question. Archetypes and memetics being control methods, essentially, methods of investigating and finding checkpoints, pinpoints within the psyche that we can branch out from further, and that we can see tangible correlations, between the inner and outer worlds, the objective and the subjective, and we could kind of, because part of measuring the subjective is finding the tether, because in order to understand the subjective, you have to kind of figure out how it relates to everything else happening around you, because solipsism doesn't really get you much of anywhere. But yeah, like it's also, with things being new aged up and the control methods, like it's important to remember that, I definitely have like a, my own beliefs and like my mystical side, but when it comes to research, I try to keep it as empirical as possible and then branch outward from there. And it's important to remember that the archetypes, like the Greek gods, for example, acknowledging that those archetypes have a reality and existence isn't acknowledging the direct literal existence of the Greek gods, and right. I think that that's probably, if anyone's done any, like, it has any real interest in archetypes, I think that it comes across well enough, but a lot of people don't understand that still, that we're dealing with like metaphysical principles, meta being an emphasis there, and we're looking at the recurring themes and why people gravitate towards these recurring themes. And what it boils down to is, adaptation principles, at least as the starting point, branching out further. And it's the way that the human experience coalesces with the forces of nature. And the only way, especially before the scientific method, the only way we had to gauge, those intersections of the microcosm and macrocosm were symbols. There's a saying that says, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. And when you take that into account on the evolutionary scale, there's plenty of prominent scientists out there that have stressed the relevance of memetics and symbol exchange in our culture, because memes are considered to the human psyche as genes are to the human biology. So when you take that into account and you start thinking about the beginning points of people starting to exchange information through symbols, the implications are very profound. And before I as a cherry on top to that, real quick, I'll say for any listeners, because it can get confusing if you're trying to be empirical. You want to toss around some concrete terms, so you got to know those terms and how they intermingle a little bit. And really, the difference between a meme and an archetype is essentially, we just said the archetype is the intersection between the objective and the subjective, and so we typify those with symbols. But when we exchange those symbols, and those are in dreams and things like that, etc., as example, but when we exchange those symbols amongst ourselves culturally, that becomes a meme. So archetypes and memes are not mutually exclusive, but they have slightly different connotations, like different contexts. And the only reason that it's that they even exist as different terms really is just because they were developed in different schools of thought. So
yeah,
that's what we got to work with.
You talk a little bit about sleep paralysis in here, and what do you make of sleep paralysis?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I find sleep paralysis fascinating because, speaking of control methods and things, a lot of this for me, I've branched out plenty, like since my initial interests. And even in the book included. But I remember years ago, sleep paralysis being an initially fascinating thing to me because, I've experienced it a couple times, nothing incredible. And it was when I was a child, so it's been a long time. But I know what it feels like. I've talked to many people who have experienced ongoing, sleep paralysis events, if you will. And I've done a lot of research into it. And so break it down a little bit, but right off the top, it's a medical condition, but you just simply can't separate it data wise from the unexplainable. Now, we know that from a scientific perspective, in layman's terms, essentially there's a jamming of the nervous system happening, when your body is shutting down and you're going into that paralysis mode. Your bodily map is essentially, through that jam process, is being projected outward. And there's other things going on as well, but that's kind of the gist of it. So we know that as the starting point. And this is kind of a good template for Fortean phenomena. And a lot of what the book starts to unpack more and more is, even if we have the template, we still are very much at a loss as to where it goes and how far it goes and why it goes so far, because hallucination aside, we could say that so people have extraordinary hallucinations with sleep paralysis, and that's a given. But then there's the other things where you hear about all the time, whether it's poltergeists or even possession, or hauntings. Sleep paralysis is often a precursor to these things. So, and granted, I think that that's probably fairly rare. And I definitely don't think that people who experience sleep paralysis are inherently being haunted or anything like that. It's certainly not possessed, because you got to be careful, throwing out words like that. The whole point of this is to not feed into dogma. But that being said, I do think that with the whole projection process and talking about archetypes and memes, I think that people, through their belief system and their perceptions, can sometimes create, a sort of proverbial bottle for a genie, and because I don't think that all of these things, take dreams, for example, you just want my personal opinion on dreams. So it's a lot of it is the projections of the psyche. That's a given. But if there's any sort of mystical thing going on, I certainly think that at least every once in a while you come across something anomalous, potentially sentient in a dreams. There's another old saying that says, if you make eye contact with something in a dream, it means that something's on the other side. Because you usually don't make eye contact with things in your dreams, hardly ever.
Huh.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that before, but that kind of resonates.
Yeah, little things like that. So just as like to illustrate the genie in the bottle type thing, like in many cases, and this still leaves us plenty more to unpack, but I very much think that we could get to a level where with altered states of consciousness, whether we do it consciously or not, usually not consciously, where things can become so vivid that they might actually take some sort of transient shape in the physical world, at least potentially.
I think that people underestimate what dreams are. I mean, yeah, sometimes they can just be your subconscious dump of stuff, of stress or whatever. But yeah, there's times I think where you're communicating with other things, you're getting precognition, you're traveling out of body. I mean, I think there's a lot more going on there, and we don't even remember most of it.
Yeah,
Right.
well, and even those subconscious dumps, I feel like, serve a purpose, right?
Yeah.
Like they're doing something to us that we need.
Yes.
I would assume.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There's nothing, but that's kind of what science assumes all dreams
Right.
are. It's just this
Okay,
subconscious
yeah.
dump, It's like, okay, so if you're dreaming about being at work, yeah, I mean, that's telling you it's probably telling you you're working too much, but, a lot of us don't have a choice in that matter.
Yeah, stress shows up a lot in those situations, or
Yeah.
also learning about things. It's something that I've heard multiple times is people, learning to ride a bike in their dreams, and they wake up and suddenly they can do it.
There's definitely
Yeah.
problem solving in dreams. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I had a friend who there's other examples of this, but this one just always stuck out to me. Like they were getting some sort of math degree in college, and we're deep in the middle of some finals, and they're talking about how like they just woke up, from deep sleep in the middle of like articulating like a really complex math formula. And like, God, I gotta, too much math. Why am I doing this dead of sleep? But yeah, so absolutely.
I was having that not too long ago. I'm learning about what they call the three-way handshake with networks and stuff, and it was just like I was waking up going like synac, like it's this whole thing. It was, why
Okay.
this is just too much.
Yeah, I know how that goes. And yeah, I'm like speaking of stress and things like that. That was one conclusion that I couldn't help but come to looking at all the data in a Hunt manual, is that there's always this underlying theme when you're looking at the unexplainable and, not always evil, but adversarial, I guess, definitely something that puts you on your toes at the very least.
Yeah.
There's this underlying theme of tension and stress, and whether it's incremental or like a big bang, like trauma, like a traumatic event, or just chronic ailments like agoraphobia and different kinds of anxieties and depression. These things all add up, and we're talking about like building blocks of the psyche and things like tension and stress to definitely contribute to these building blocks and contribute to the whole heap of the temple that you're building of your mind, body, and spirit. And if we don't take the steps, part of the learning that trade is learning the steps to like detune, unwind, purge some of that tension, because I mean, life in and of itself, you can't get around it. It's wrought full of tensions and traumas and things. And one thing that science definitely shows us, even about the unexplainable for that matter, is that, and I'll explain that a little bit as we go along, but when we don't have ways to purge that tension, it will manifest itself anyway in ways that we, that are probably worse off for not being chosen, and art being a very good example of this, people purging that tension, creative release. And then as another practical example on the other end, addiction, and you could find this data in sleep paralysis most of the time, if not all of the time, honestly. People who experience sleep paralysis, especially chronically, are either experiencing like trauma from a big event or one of those chronic incremental things. And The same, phantom limb is another interesting example of this on a practical level, because there's been studies done to show that, first off, you don't even have to be an amputee to experience the phantom limb syndrome, which is a very interesting thing. It has more to do with like an evolutionary bodily map. And, in the book Phantoms in the Brain, the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran stumbles across this, or experiments rather, and finds control methods and goes about studies with several different patients and finds that, through like a mirror, he creates like a mirror box, like a shoe box almost, where he reflects the intact limb into the place where the other limb is missing. And by creating the illusion and wiggling the intact limb, they experience relief and animation of the phantom limb. And the more people did this over time, the more they found, the majority of them found that their phantom pain went away or diminished, almost like going to a gym and exercising the phantom limb in a way.
Yeah.
And I very much think of dreams as the same kind of thing, especially in their initial premise. We're animating these limbs that exist. It's tension, it's dormant tension, and we have to animate them in order to expunge them. But we also have to be prepared for what we animate, and that's a whole different thing right there.
There's a quote from near the end of your book that I took down because I really liked it. And it says, perhaps a bright-hearted utopia would be great, but it's not human. For us, we have to come to terms with the dark so it doesn't rob us of the light entirely, and we have to make sure we keep the dark around us at the same time so the light doesn't fry our eyes permanently.
True. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, I mean, straight up, absolutely.
There needs to be balance, is basically what you're saying.
Absolutely, because I am, and that's kind of a takeaway from the material as well. Having written a book, it's pretty horrific in terms of the subject matter, just by definition. But and there's certainly there's a certain level of a law of attraction in terms of like what you put your intent into. But in terms of just a copy and paste, positive, negative law of attraction type thing, like there's a million examples out there, but I'm another one of them. Like I am steep, to write this book, I was steeped in everything like real and fictional horror. If you do it, that's kind of the alchemical context, because if you do it with the right intentions and the right context, it doesn't delude you or jade you. It helps you reconcile some things, come to terms with things. Is shadow work, essentially, as many people say. And, we all have like an existential responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, to come to terms with the lesser aspects of ourselves, because we all have it. Like we all have the potential to be horrible. And I think that if we don't recognize that at least potential, I think you become more susceptible to it happening.
That's fair.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up tension and sort of this struggle almost, and I sort of see that as being a factor that pushes living beings forward into change, right? Without struggle, without tension, without that kind of like challenge or a need to survive, even with hunting, for instance, we sort of stagnate, right? We kind of get into a place that's comfortable, a place where we feel satisfied with whoever we are or doing whatever we're doing, and we kind of forget that we need to be doing that work, that sort of shadow work, to improve ourselves, because nobody's perfect. Even if you're comfortable, you're not perfect.
In my life, there was one point where I was completely and totally content, and I was miserable at the same time.
Yeah, it figures.
Interesting how that works. Yeah, I feel you.
That kind of put me through, like, I think the first time I went through sort of that dark night of the soul, because I'm like, why am I not happy? I mean, I'm content. Everything is great. This is everything I wanted. Why am I not happy?
Were you bored?
I think so. Yeah, I think I just didn't have anything driving me forwards.
Yeah, I think that's that's something I've noticed over time, that I feel like, different strokes for different folks, right? But like that's always been my case in life is getting bored with being content and sort of needing to put myself in situations where, I'm, well, in one way or another challenged, and sometimes it's a little detrimental, whether to my physical health or, emotional health or money, or whatever.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
you get into a place where you can feel that challenge, and that helps, it helps you learn.
Yes.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, that's why I write, and that's why I, do what I do here. It's, there's a time, Dive Manual talks about that a bit more. It's got a little bit more of some personal exposition in order to highlight some of the material. And yeah, I mean, there was a time where I had no idea. I mean, we all go through times where we're kind of aimless and we don't really know what we're doing. And I don't know, it can be more detrimental than, I went through definitely a self-destructive phase. You don't have to, I think people confuse being self-critical and self-analytical with being self-destructive sometimes. And I mean, it's all about context, because I've had people tell me, especially in the past, that I think too much. You need to stop thinking so much. And after a while, I came to the conclusion that that's terrible advice. You don't need to think less. You just need to have more awareness with the metacognition, where your thoughts going, and what's the big picture here, because you don't want to waste your energy and thoughts. And I mean, that's what, anxiety and all these tensions are and things. But yeah. And I also, it's worth putting the cherry on top of that point, because I did all the legwork and I don't think I articulated the last bit. But when it comes to sleep paralysis and dreams and that whole tension quality, I think it very much is everything to do with the unexplainable and the Fortean, the paranormal, etc. People talk about, people squabble over, how much of the UFO is physical and how much of it is this metaphysical thing, and if there's both, or what kind of ratio. Inside it. Yeah,
I like that
part. Thanks. But there's Poltergeist as another great example. As I started developing this idea more and more, I had this moment in the writing process where I was like, oh yeah, this is essentially the a much more expanded version of the idea that of adolescents undergoing poltergeists, or like Stephen King's Carrie type thing. And because that's really, in terms of tension and stress and trauma in the nervous system, the more that we dig into the sort of the common denominators of the empirical data, the more we find that this is a big one right here, this whole purgative quality. And when we, this is what Keel was stabbing at with the title, The Mothman Prophecies. So it's not even like it's anything new. This is exactly what Jung's best guess was as to what was happening with the UFO phenomena. The only time he wrote about it in his little book. And I mean, this is what Jacques Vallée talks about time and time again. And I don't want to completely discount the mechanics of it. I don't really focus on the mechanics of the UFO, for instance, because I know that there are these psychological archetypal implications. And so just kind of where that's kind of my wheelhouse. I'm interested in that. But I don't know. It could very well, there could be there could definitely be some physical implications, and I know there are some people where that's more in their wheelhouse. So the UFO is it's a tangled web, and there's plenty other people talking about it. But you can't. It's a part of the conversation, and it's one that makes it particularly. It makes it a lot harder to discount things on a purely subjective level. So, I mean, even Jung talked about it in his book how they show up on radars. You can't deny that. So Poltergeist being another great example of the physicality just coming from seemingly out of nowhere.
Well, my thing that I've been pushing for a while now is that no matter what paranormal phenomena you're looking at, you get lights and you get poltergeist phenomena. It may not be recognized as poltergeist phenomena. You know, if you're a Bigfoot hunter, you're getting stones thrown at you. You're hearing vocalizations and all this other stuff. That is basically poltergeist phenomena in the woods.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and
that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, and any of this stuff, you look at it like people who have near-death experiences afterwards experience poltergeist activity. You know, when there are cryptid encounters breaking at like waves of cryptid sightings, you have people also reporting poltergeist activity. People who have witnessed UFOs often have poltergeist activity afterwards.
Yeah, great point. And having researched some people who were trying to look for control methods in these things, that was definitely something that I came across. Just the idea, definitely some food for thought further, but like as a general context, with the unexplainable phenomena, just because we can't explain it doesn't mean that we can't observe it, meaning that, I mean, not only like can we not see it in these things, but also you can kind of look at the ontology of it a little bit, or at least, you know, some of the, what's the word I'm looking for? We can look at some of the symptoms of it. Like you look at the poltergeist phenomena, we don't fully know where that comes from, but there's like a really classic checklist of poltergeist phenomena, and everybody knows it. And it's the same thing with when you look into the more legitimate food for thought regarding exorcisms and possession today. You know, the book, what is it called? Demonic Foes by Dr. Richard Gallagher. You guys, you read the book, my book, which I appreciate. Yeah. But were you familiar with Richard Gallagher at all before that?
I know the name. I've not read his book.
I was not familiar, and yeah.
Okay, just curious because he's been around a little bit. Like he wrote a Washington Post article a few years before the book, and that floated around real well. But and it's a really good book for anybody that wants some grounded food for thought. Because this guy's, you know, he's an Ivy League trained and practicing psychiatrist for like 3 decades or something, and half of his career he's been like a consultant, if you will, for Catholic priests. And it's a little ironic because, you know, obviously Catholics have probably done the most harm with exorcism rites and these things than anybody else. But I mean, these days, especially with certain cases like Annalise Michel, which drew a lot of attention on the mainstream scale to some of the malpractice of exorcisms. These days, right, at least in terms of like the institution itself, you know, in order to like avoid human rights violations in these things, and you know, there are plenty of good priests out there, even if they can be corrupt. But
sure,
point being that yeah, well, the exorcism rites have actually been very well maintained and updated, and the reason for including people like Dr. Gallagher is to further differentiate and scrutinize the difference between mental illness and something like possession. And, you know, again, Gallagher is still in practice today, and he's well respected, and he's very open about the position, his position being that the vast majority of the time, this is these are medical diagnoses, but every once in a while we get truly anomalous, unexplainable phenomena, and you know, to deny it is just foolish. We don't. So
yeah, and you sort of have that checklist of those kind of types of phenomena that you're talking about too.
Exactly. So yeah. I mean, just because we don't understand it doesn't mean we can't be empirical about it.
True.
Right. Yeah. I was curious, before we get too far away from the UFO topic, you know, so you mentioned some UFO experiences in the book coming from the perspective of your narrator, the hunter. But I was wondering if those are have you had UFO experiences? Is that what you're referring to there, or was that more of a narrative technique?
No, those are actually those are the like abridged versions of my sightings. You know, that's pretty much exactly how they happened. Just kind of leaving out some details because I didn't want to make like a long. I didn't want to make too much of a rabbit hole there. I didn't want to veer off into UFOs too much, but I brought it up in Dive Manual a little bit, and I figured if I'm writing this other book and UFOs are already going to come up, I might as well go into a little more detail. But I mean, you know, I'm not, I never took any videos or anything. I don't really care if people believe me. I'm just sharing my stories. But, you know, for what it's worth, I saw definitely some wild stuff in Alaska, whether it's government black budget stuff or UFOs, or ETs, I mean, or, you know, what have you. It was definitely like a quote unquote UFO, that's for sure. I saw them on a handful of occasions. So weird stuff floats in the sky, that's for sure.
Would you mind describing your experiences, I guess, for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, long story short, there's 3 occasions that you know, because I saw him a handful of times doing weird stuff in the sky far enough away where, you know, making weird turns and stuff where you don't really know what's going on up there, but you know that those aren't stars. And yeah, but there was one time in particular where I saw one, you know, fly faster than a shooting star and do a 90-degree angle turn in the sky. I'll never forget that. But there were the 2 biggest ones where I actually got a pretty close-up look at them. One, I was by myself, and they were all around between like midnight and 3 a.m. And they were always in, you know, I was always living out in Alaska. There's like plenty of population when you stay, you know, around Anchorage and things like that. I mean, obviously a lot of the state's desolate, but even in the populated areas, there's so much wilderness. So you're never far from the woods. And the first time I saw it, my neighborhood was kind of like circling just this wooded area. And I just saw a bright light fly out from the woods, and very slowly and silently. And I thought it was like a street light from the lumber yard on the other side. But it kept coming closer towards me. And, you know, at the time I just had like a burner flip phone anyway. So I didn't bother to take any pictures or anything. I didn't believe what I was seeing. So I just wanted to absorb as much as I could. And it got real close. Man, it was just above my rooftops. Like if my house was 2 stories, it was probably like 5 stories in the air. It was real close. And again, silent. It was a triangle with the tip cut off. And it actually had on the tips a little bit of red and blue and then white in the center. And for a split second, I thought, oh, okay, well, at least I know this is just a commercial plane. But again, it was like no more than 5 stories above me and moving silently and lurking.
Yeah.
And it was a triangle shape with the tip cut off.
Yeah. And I just followed it as far as I could. And it like crossed the street. So, you know, it's just traversing through wooded areas. So you can't go too far. And it eventually disappears behind the Chugach mountain range, for anybody interested in the geography there. So I was in Eagle River, Alaska at the time, right outside of Anchorage. And the second time, basically, I was just coming home from a friend's house. You know, we had smoked a little bit. We had drank a little bit earlier. No, I was not drunk, though. You know, it was just a late night. And, you know, again, around like 1 or 2 a.m. or something, driving home through the woods, but, you know, it's a regular paved road and all that. We just see something right above the tree line, the same thing, essentially, to not mince words. And
same type of triangle with all the same
type
details.
Of triangle. Yeah, except instead of the belly shot, I saw it from the side, and it was bulbous. I thought it would have a lot more angles, sharp angles, but it was bulbous. And it caught our attention because it was flashing so bright. It would flash for like a second, really bright, and then be off for like 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And it just did that repeatedly, but it was so damn bright that it looked like daytime around it for that, just that flash second. And it's just truly unexplainable because if I try to think of it, you know, it's Occam's razor. Like if it's government, that doesn't make any sense. Like it was very conspicuous. And also I start to wonder, you know, I didn't hear about anybody else here and they're reporting anything. I mean, I know that kind of that stuff's hush hush, but I feel like someone would would say something like someone would make headlines or like local something. I don't know. It was so bright. It was so bright. And
Oh, sure. Yep. It was very obvious.
Yeah. So I don't know. It doesn't make any sense for government, but it makes even less sense for ETs to be coming from another planet and just lurking around the woods for no apparent reason. So I don't know. It's just one of those things. So I know that UFOs are a thing, but and I know that there is this like psychological component, this archetypal. We're probably providing the bottle for the genie, but there's probably a genie. That's the best way to put it.
I like.
That's a good. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I like how you say that you don't like to call them extraterrestrials, but they're definitely alien.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm very much in that same boat. Whatever we're dealing with is definitely alien, but not necessarily extraterrestrial.
And by alien, you mean other and sort of
Alien
outside our experience.
Right, alien to us.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
that's a really good way to look at it.
ultra-terrestrial is a good term too, but it just sounds like, I don't know, on some level, all this stuff is really weird and outlandish, but like I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, and I just feel like if I'm talking about ultra-terrestrials, it just sounds like I'm living in a comic book.
Right.
So just aliens, it's the classic term. There's nothing wrong with that. People keep trying to update it. Like we're talking about UAPs now. I'm sticking with UFOs, man. I don't need to update all these things.
I mean, it's just another term that basically means the same thing.
Yeah, I don't even understand it. It doesn't even seem to like make things shorter or elaborate anything.
Well,
I don't know.
It's almost
that I think is
it's
part
like-
of the control
sorry.
system.
Yeah. Yeah, and like
Yeah.
vying for credibility or trying to manage people's perceptions on what this stuff is or whether or not it's real even.
Yeah.
I feel like that. It's like, oh well, UFOs aren't real, but those UAPs, no, that's something serious.
Exactly.
Or whatever.
Right. Good point. Absolutely. That's one reason I try to shy away. It's kind of, I don't know. It's funny because I'm inherently skeptical. Like I probably wouldn't even talk about UFOs very much at all if not for the fact that I had seen them. But so I'm just kind of inevitably tied into it. But all of the government data and stuff, I did journalism before I just really dived into esotericism and Forteana, and I got burnt out on it because it feels like you're just, eating the breadcrumbs that are given to you, the scraps that are given to you. Like this is your talking point for today per the mainstream media and your politicians. It's like, I got tired of being on that leash. Just like, okay, is this what I'm going to think about today?
Yeah.
And UFOs is unfortunately where that mindset bleeds into what I find to be a much more freeform, creative approach to the world. And I'm really not trying to like dog anybody too much, but just to be honest, I can't stand that whole like, okay, what are we going to talk about with UFOs today? What's the data dump going to be? The ufologists are always waiting on that next government report. It's just the dangling carrot, man. I'm so tired of that mentality.
And that is exactly what it is a dangling carrot, and it's been going on for decades.
Yeah, literally
So long.
decades.
You'd think they'd figure it out by now, but they haven't yet.
Well, that's because you have new people coming into it who haven't gone through it already, and they think, well,
True.
this time it's different.
Yeah, I
Is it
I've
ever
been there.
though?
I mean, coming into this stuff, I'm only 26, but like, I'm glad that I found your guys' shows, here, Where Did the Road Go, and sort of adjacent shows, because listening to some of you guys who have been around a while and seen the different patterns was really valuable. But yeah, it is. It's just sort of the rope-a-dope,
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it sure is. Yeah, that's why I love talking to people older and wiser than me, the people who have been around the block.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a saying I was told long ago. It's just like a general rule of thumb to try to never be the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
And you could take that as just hanging out with a bunch of dummies, but what is meant to be is always be challenging yourself to hang out with people that force you to rise to the occasion, essentially. And there's a whole lot of back patting and just like personal applause that goes on, and all of the stuff we talk about, ufology and esotericism and bold claims without substantiation. And that's why I go through lengths to provide a bibliography, and I look at primary sources. A lot of the unexplainable phenomena in the book Hunt Manual comes from police reports, and I understand why people would be skeptical, because you see people just, again, without these control methods, just tossing out ideas. You hear people talk about Lemurians and Pleiadians, and they go like, oh, it's so much, and it's, I'm not even opposed to people theorizing and having those ideas and speculating, because it's not even theorizing, speculating. And but like when you take that as like you're totally sold on it, that's where you definitely start to lose me, because there's no more empiricism left at all. And so yeah, I get why people will be skeptical, but on the other hand, you have the scientism and people who are just totally ready and willing and able to discount what happens right before their eyes. And yeah, I mean, both are extremely imperfect views of the world. I can't imagine why people would settle for either, to be honest.
Yeah. Yep, totally lost what I was just going to say. I did want to address one of the things you talk about in the book, though, which is space travel. You're talking about extraterrestrials and stuff, and you said that, we don't know if we can actually leave the Earth. And that's something that I've brought up many times, that we are so interconnected to our planet in ways that we don't understand. Are we actually going to be able to go to someplace like Mars? And if we do, what's going to happen to us?
Absolutely, man. If you want my personal opinion, it's not, we don't know for sure yet, but I mean, the data does show that the human being would be severely limited in space, and it's not just gravity and things and like floating around. It's, as I talk about in the book a little bit, the space madness is a legitimate concern. And I mean, think about it, man. Most people, even if they don't consider themselves claustrophobic, they don't want to be like confined in a space for too long. That's going to really it's going to radically change the human condition and the human experience. Getting used to space travel and then colonizing another planet, like, well, I mean, unless you have the same environment as Earth, you're going to have the same issue of being pigeonholed and stuck in these places. And I think that people totally discount that. Like they think it's just going to be really easy. And granted, I've heard, there's epigenetics is a thing, and even though the evolutionary scale plays out in a very long time, people would adapt a little bit, but I don't know how much. There's definitely a chance that we wouldn't be able to adapt quick enough, and if we did, we probably would be radically different than we are now. So yeah, space travel as we perceive it, like that whole Star Wars kind of angle, I genuinely don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible for anything. That's remains a large part of my skepticism with the ET as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think how we might change, culturally, or in our individual personalities or identities if we get too far away from the system that we're a part of. Let alone, you talk about nobody wants to be cramped up in like a small space for too long. That's obviously that's where you can survive, but nobody else wants to be outside in this giant, vast, endlessness, right? Like that we can look up at night and see the stars and sort of take it for granted, but we're not there. We're not at the edge of it, right? If you're doing like a spacewalk on the ISS even, or whatever, and you're just out in it, and it's like it's endless, and it's just there. Like you can touch it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Space. I tell you what, if they start drafting people for colonization on other planets, I'm out. I'm out of the colonization. Like I'm sticking here. I mean, because they could go do their thing and roll all the dice they want. Even if Earth is like some sort of Blade Runner dystopia, I'll just kick it here, man. I don't care. I don't want to deal with that space travel.
I think it'll probably be a while before that happens. We got to let all the rich people get off planet first.
Right.
Yeah, to be real, people toss around all sorts of conspiracy theories, and I think that one of them that holds the most weight, it just seems the most practical to me, is the whole breakaway civilization kind of idea. It does seem that like the rich do want to get away from us and want to leave us behind.
But at the same time, they want us to prop them up. I mean, they need us for that.
True. Absolutely.
Yup.
Yeah, it's definitely very complicated. But let's see. Yeah, I mean, you guys want to talk about what do you want to talk about next? We got some more stuff.
As far as the space travel thing too. I mean, we are so ingrained with the planet, with the and you mentioned the sun too. The sun has a massive effect on us.
Oh, that's a big point. Yeah.
And even the moon, is all these systems, and probably plenty of systems we don't know anything about, are interacting with us all the time. So if we get outside of that and we change that, like, we have no idea what that will do. Like, we have nothing to base it on.
Yeah, I'm glad we stayed on this topic a little longer, because that's a great point. I mean, let alone the Earth's electromagnetic field and how that might play a role in our consciousness. The sun in and of itself, which also plays its role in the Earth's electromagnetic field, but like all of the implications of the sun. Our galaxy seems very much in that sort of Platonic harmony of the spheres sense. It's an intricate balance, and I think that who's to say how far the implications go, but I think it's very evident that we would have a whole host. Like, as soon as we started getting into that sort of space travel, even no matter how much we could account for, like gravity and whatever else, we would undoubtedly find more things. Because it's just like a blank slate. It's like, you're never going to know. You probably won't be able to find all the leaks in a bag or something until you fill it with water, and then once you fill it with water, it might be too late.
Right. Yep.
But speaking of like wooey stuff on this same line, but like trying to be empirical and still finding value in it, like, so astrology is really interesting because, first of all, it's imperfect. I don't think that people should be reading like daily horoscopes and things. I think it go way over the top, and I don't even use astrology in my life, but I've looked into the history of it and the implications. And I mean, as the philosophy of astronomy, it's not a science, it's a philosophy. And a lot of astrologers do it the disservice of trying to push it as something very concrete. And I think that's where they lose a lot of their merit, to be honest with you. But I mean, it is tied into astronomy, especially when you look at the historical roots. And I also think that it's very safe to say that what you're looking at with astrology is not even like any sort of resonance from the other planets, although that might and probably plays a role. The core element being the Earth's relationship to the sun. Because astrology goes into the precession of the equinoxes and the great Platonic year. And I think that, if nothing else, you could set all the other bubblegum pop astrology aside and like look at the core elements of the great Platonic year and how that, juxtapose that to the evolutionary scale and human consciousness. And the fact that the Platonic year, the precession of the equinoxes, denotes the relationship and the distance that the Earth has to the sun. I mean, I think it's very obvious that we have an integral. The human experience kind of hinges a lot on that relationship. So
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say Star Wars is gonna be hard, man. It's very hard.
Well, and astrology too, as a philosophy of the planets and of the stars and such, I feel like is incredibly relative to our understanding and our perception of those bodies, right? Like when we talk about like retrograde, for instance, when a planet appears to be moving backwards in its orbit, that's relative to us. The planet's not changing its orbit. It's it's doing its own thing.
Right.
The way that we look at the planets, or like I said, the sun or the moon or the stars and stuff, is very much how we look at it here on Earth. It's a very like specific thing to us. And you're right, it's not a science, and it doesn't, it's not something that could necessarily be relied on like a science. It makes it very hard for it to be empirical. What's really interesting, though, about astrology is you do end up having some situations where there's either profound meaning that's derived from sort of astrological associations or doing readings or whatever the case, or people are able to occasionally get something to line up really well for their for their fortune, like
Right.
People looking to invest in stocks or whatever, and it doesn't always work, right? It's not something concrete like that, but it does sometimes, and it makes that sometimes I think kind of helps poke at it and make it feel like there's more of a concrete nature to it than maybe there is, which I think is also very similar to aspects of the paranormal. It's
Right.
4 out of 10 times you've seen a UFO in this spot, but you don't see it every time, right? Or whatever.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the heuristic method in and of itself there, and whether it be astrology or our perceptions of the UFO. I mean, you can look at the way that the UFO has manifested itself, and that curve, how it changes it. Excuse me, in the way it manifests itself to us, alongside our perceptions of it in the media and in science fiction and things. I think that it's really hard to discount those things. And if you want to really consider it, you have to eventually go with the approach that there is some sort of, the human experience is catalyzing something in a way. Vallée called it the completion of a circuit happening here. That the human psyche completes some sort of circuit. And I don't think it, I think that, so some people would say that this whole perspective that we're taking is reductionary or reductionist in the sense of it places the human being too much at the forefront, like making the human being almost in a solipsistic way, like the center of the cosmos. And it's really not about that. Like, to reiterate a point earlier, we're trying to find control methods and common denominators, and practically the only common denominator we can find for all of this is that human beings experience it.
Right.
And so you have to start
Exactly.
there. And yeah. But yeah, people even before our conception of the UFO and science fiction, Vallée talks about how they were seeing pirate ships in the sky.
Yeah.
And then, and there's all the relationship to the Fae, etc. I don't think, so Ancient Aliens is pretty funny. And I definitely don't take it literally. And a lot of it is just basically throwaway. But I mean, the idea in and of itself, like the History Channel, but Von Daniken, he at least had an interesting premise. Like, I do think that the archetypes have been around for a while. So I think that there's probably some sort of archetypal weight to that, in the sense that, these things, similar to our conceptions of gods and goddesses and devils, we've always had weird things flying in the sky. It's just a part of the kaleidoscope.
You get into your thoughts on hypnosis in here, which are pretty interesting. You want to talk a little bit about how you view hypnosis, especially as it relates to like the UFO field and such?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find some good material on hypnosis as well in Dive Manual, because I do, I laid some good groundwork earlier talking about like the nervous system and things like that, tension, etc. And there are many scientists that have talked about how hypnosis is one of the primary gateways from the psyche to the nervous system, and because on a practical level, people new age it up with this too. But we know on a practical, very empirical, scientific level that there are a lot of benefits to hypnosis, and it's all geared around this purgative quality, this tension reduction.
Right.
And, there's a couple things that hypnosis is not good for is recovering memories. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that's what it's been used for the most, especially in our fields of interest.
Yeah.
And granted, I think that, so I say this in the book, it's similarly to dreams, where you can kind of like interpret your dreams and find some common themes. I think that if you're doing something like, if you're trying to quote unquote recover memories from hypnosis, you should really look at it at best as some sort of like artificial dream, if you will. There could be some psychological value in there, but what the last thing you should do is actually consider it a real recovered memory, right? Because that's just simply not how hypnosis works. That's not what the data shows. None of it. And that's what's fed into not only a lot of red herrings in UFO research, but I mean that's like probably like 60% of the reason, if not more, that we have this overflow of satanic panic that still happens to this day. You look at the vast majority, and granted, and this is something I talk about in the book as well, you can find archetypal evil, and you can find cults that are into this, whether it's Satan or the archetypal evil. It's around, but what you can also find is that there are just as many quote unquote Christian cults that do the same kind of thing, and you got to look at the meta involved here. But I mean, anyway, I digress.
Speaking of cults and stuff, you actually in the book you'd brought up a really interesting factor that was sort of related to cults, sort of related to some of the murderers, something that I had never heard before, and that is this kind of common thread in a lot of those cases, not all of them, but a lot of them, of epileptic seizures. What is that about?
What is that about? It's a curious one, because you can find the recurring themes, but where it goes in the long run is something that we're all gonna have to mull over a little bit, if we want to figure it out. But I can lay out a lot.
What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, because I mean, no one is gonna have the full answers here, but there's when you look at the empiricism of it, we're talking about control methods, and we also talked about symptomology and things like that. We could find that demonology in and of itself most certainly comes from medical diagnosis first and foremost. They were using demons as ways to categorize things the way we would use ADHD to categorize something. And in many ways, it was that literal. And epilepsy was one of those things, and so was sleep paralysis and many other things. And but epilepsy is interesting on the historical scale, because whereas a lot of psychiatric disorders, unless you're really analyzing someone, might be hard to like fully pinpoint. Epilepsy is something that's a bit more obvious, and as I talk about in the book a little bit, you can find on the historical record many people that have, many artists and visionaries, some of which are disputed because it's so far in the historical record. But the famous writer Dostoevsky definitely had epilepsy, and like Julius Caesar and Dante and many others were considered to have it. And so it seems, especially with temporal lobe epilepsy, where there's this focus on, or it's localized around the temporal lobe, which has a lot to do with essentially our our imaginational processes of like our environment around us, like how we,
Okay.
you know, the memes and archetypes, the kind of all the things we're talking about here. So when temporal lobe epilepsy is a thing, not only do you have very intense seizures, but part of the symptoms of that are these powerful, almost psychedelic-esque out-of-body experiences, and they can be very good or very bad. And so you find that in a lot of serial killers as well, and you also find that in a lot of possession cases as well. I couldn't give you a number because no one's done for comprehensive studies like that. But I know the really well-known case of Annalise Michel, the famous possession that became the basis for the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, etc. She definitely had temporal lobe epilepsy, and on the serial killer spectrum, Richard Ramirez was definitely known to have temporal lobe epilepsy. And there are others where, we don't know if it was specific with the temporal lobe or not, but we could go through a lot of other serial killers. Like Gacy was known to have seizures, especially in their childhoods. And Berkowitz was known to have seizures, and Son of Sam. I can't remember what their names were, but Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, they're pretty infamous serial killers there. They were well known. They're notorious for creating stories that are probably completely false, if not like 99% false, about them working with a order called the Black Hand and being involved with human trafficking and things like that. And Henry Lee Lucas is the one that George H.W. Bush actually pardoned from the electric chair. I don't know if you guys know that story, but that's not conspiracy theory at all. That's like traditional headlines. And a lot of conspiracy theorists like to point to that as like some weird Illuminati thing going on. But realistically, as far as I'm concerned and everyone else is concerned, really, he was pardoned because he lied about it all. They definitely were killers, but they killed like a handful of people. But I digress. They definitely had epilepsy as well. And you can... point being here that, and this is something that Dr. Gallagher talks about in his book about possession. And I don't think that people are being possessed here or anything, but at the very least, talking about valves of like consciousness and how much we can purge this tension and things. Now, you think about it from just the practical perspective. When you have too much tension, you're going to start to have messed up dreams, potentially, a dream, nightmares that you don't want. You might not sleep well at all. Your life is going to be, you feel like not quite you. So if you take that to the extreme and you think about like developmental issues and just childhood issues that most, if not all, these serial killers have, and then you add something that's just a regular medical condition, just an epileptic seizure on top of it. It's the context that's key. So someone, a beautiful writer like Dostoevsky, is Crime and Punishment, for example. That was a guy, he could take that and find the beauty in it. But some people like, Richard Ramirez, for example, it's just going to make it worse. And Annalise Michel is an interesting example of both of those things happening, where sometimes her seizure, the vision she would have during those seizures would be divine, and they would be communications with the Virgin Mary. And sometimes it would be very satanic, and eventually it snowballed as things got more and more traumatic and stressful. It got to the point where all she saw were demons. And so we talk about providing our archetypal, like psychological bottles for a genie. I think that this is definitely something that happens. And I think that in rare instances, things can definitely, I'm definitely open to the idea that where I don't think it's straightforward and dogmatic, I do think that the human brain can be invaded, at least in certain instances. And there's a lot, there's a whole lot we could go on, but because I want to stay on topic a little bit, but it's not even far-fetched to consider the invasion of our psyches by something else when you just simply remember that memes in and of themselves are considered viral by nature.
Yeah,
and they like to incubate and replicate. So just on that alone, it provides a bit more meat to sink your teeth into there. But so I don't think that like serial killers are being possessed or anything, but at the very least, I think that when you look at this archetypal symbolic perspective, you could definitely make the case for obsession. I mean, it's kind of a given. And people often forget that when you're talking archetypally, the classic states of demonology and the interaction of the demon with the human being would be obsession, oppression, and possession. So, people often tend to focus just on the possession angle. And, I think it's also important to bring up here real quick before you guys untangle the mess I've made here. Heuristic is an important term to bring up for anybody that's not familiar with it, because heuristic is it's a descriptive term, and it can also be used as a unit of psychological measurement, like a meme or an archetype. And the heuristic is this trial and error method human beings have used and continue to use to grasp at things they do not understand. So if you think about it, like before we even had the scientific method, I mean, these are the things that this is literally what bridges the gap between the imagination and just random guesswork and the scientific method. Back before we knew what empiricism was, we would use observation and a trial and error to try and bridge that gap. And, good examples of that being today, even today, a lot of people think that porcupines shoot their quills, excuse me. And they don't. But and if you think that you're going to get that answer wrong on the test, but if you think that, you also might stay further away from porcupines and you might be better off for it.
Right.
So there is a little bit of an adaptational value there. And so when we're talking about demonology and getting into some real outer limits territory, it's important to remember that these things are not literal, but that doesn't mean that they're throwaway either. Like that's the whole point of having these conversations, is to say, okay, is to try and separate the wheat from the chaff here and figure out what's going on and what, if anything, are the concrete takeaways. And again, when you look at cases that are just unbelievably well documented, like the possession of Annalise Michel or some of these police reports that I talk about in my book, I totally understand the reason for skepticism. And I mean, I pretty much advocate it. I think it's important to be skeptical, but also you can't, just one of these cases, if one of these cases is true, it changes the whole ball game. And there's no way that not one of them's true, man. You look at the data and there's a lot of them that are true. You just, there's no other way to explain certain stories.
So we are.
I think you're absolutely right. It is important to be skeptical. Sorry, go ahead, Soraya.
Oh, we're actually out of time. So why don't we continue? Why don't we continue this on a Patreon segment? But first, Anthony, why don't you tell people where they can find your books and any other info you want them to know?
Yeah, man, this conversation flew by. This was a fun time. You could find me at divemind.net, and you could find the first chapter of Hunt Manual. You can also find some excerpts from Dive Manual. You can find links to purchase both books, and you can find my other chats and interviews that I've done there. You can find me on Twitter if you want, DiveMind667, and I'm on Facebook, Anthony Tyler. I love to I love to engage in dialogues. You got any questions or just want to reach out, I'd be happy to hear from you. And I appreciate anybody listening. This was a great time.
All right, and
this is super fun.
Taylor, people can find you where?
Oh man, I'm at the Green Lion podcast, which you can find on any kind of podcasting area. I'm also on Twitter. My username is AETTIC, it's Edic, and greenlinepublishing.com.
Okay. Thank you both, and we'll continue this in a Patreon segment. This show would not be possible without the help of our Patreons. And a special thanks to those of you pledging $10 or more: Allison Cook, Super Inframan, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, the 100th Monkey Project, a blue second generation MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Limina, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Christopher Ernst, Craig Cicernos, Craig Parmenter, Crystal Ann Compton, David Moore, Denise Sarek, Diane B., Diona Bidwell, Dominic O'Malley, Duffy Dowder, Edu Camahort, MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, J. Otto Bullitt, Joanna Rojas, John W. Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Kristen L., Linz Jackson K., Luke Osborne, Mark Brady, Matt in Delaware, Patricia W., Paul Jeffries, Ray Benedetto, Riker and Stark, Roger Gonzalez, Sam Sharon, Sedgder, Stone Wilderness, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler H. Glimstead, Vincent Trewell, Walker, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Martinez Saint, and Stephen D. Thank you all so very, very much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.